My name is Matt Charney, and I am the managing editor of recruitingvlogs.com, and that's where you can find us on Twitter. And I am very excited to introduce today's panelists about digital interviewing and candidate experience. Obviously, candidate experience has been a topic we've been talking about and focusing on in recruiting for quite some time. But obviously, with the advent of digital interviews, we're given a very powerful new tool and technology to help enable organizations and employers of all sizes to really make a substantial difference when it comes to candidate experience. So we'll be talking a little bit about how those two trends correlate and what you actually need to know from the people who know it in order to do it right at your organization. So without further ado, I am going to let our panelists introduce themselves, starting off with our benevolent sponsor and a man who is at the helm of one of the top digital interviewing technologies in the market today, and that's David Whelan, who is the CEO of RIZ. David, welcome.
Thanks, Matt. Hi, everybody. Again, David Whelan here. I'm the CEO of RIZ. And RIZ is an online software platform that allows companies to easily add one-way pre-recorded and live video interviews to the hiring process. Corporations like DirecTV, Chicago Public Schools, CareerBuilder, Monster, etc. Take advantage of our platform to gain significantly higher quality insights into their candidates faster than they ever could before. RIZ was started a couple years ago out of some frustrations at my last company, where we realized our hiring process was really slow and pretty inefficient, as well as the quality of candidates coming through just was not that great. We had a bit of a light bulb moment one day when we were conducting phone screens about a month and a half after we actually posted the job, and we said, you know what, this is the most important part of this process for us, for this role. Why don't we make this the first piece and try to automate it as much as possible? So that's when we built the first version of RIZ many, many years ago, and it's now blossomed today to be, as you mentioned, one of the top digital interview providers on the market. So thanks for having us.
Yeah, great, and thank you for joining us. Next, the man who needs no introduction, but he will give a brief one anyway, is Jerry Crispin, who is the Chief Navigator of Career Crossroads, as well as one of the founders of the Candidate Experience Awards. Welcome, Jerry. Jerry, would you like to throw in a few words of background for anyone who might not know you or be familiar with your work?
Jerry, you might need to enter the audio.
I think Jerry's still muted.
Yeah.
No, I think Jerry's muted.
Well, that's the first time that Jerry has ever been muted, so.
Jerry, your audio pin is pound 96 pound.
Okay.
Pound 96 pound.
Obviously, our video interviewing solution not nearly as elegant as RIZ Enterprise solution, so thank you for bearing with us. We'll move on to Ed Newman, who is also one of the co-founders of the Candidate Experience Awards, and who is currently the VP of Strategy at iMomentus. Welcome, Ed.
Thank you very much, Matt. Glad to be here. As you suggested, currently VP of Strategy for iMomentus, and one of the founding board members of the Talent Board and the Candidate Experience Awards. I've been in the recruiting field, HR, recruiting, talent technology, for about 30 years. So sort of grew up with all of the technology that supports recruiting and all of its evolutions. And you know, one of the reasons for the Candidate Experience Awards was because we've come so far in the technology, yet we still have so far to go in terms of how we leverage that to create a better candidate experience. We focused very, very specifically on our internal recruiting function and efficiencies, and very little of the work over the last couple of decades has been focused on the candidate experience, although the last 5-6 years there's been a pretty big movement, and very, very pleased to see how the movement has grown and how far the needle has come. So without further ado, I believe Jerry is now officially online. So Jerry, over to you.
So. Andrew and I were having some fun talking to each other, wondering what the hell happened to that. But that's great. We're back. We can talk. So you can hear me well, right, Matt?
Yeah, you're coming through loud and clear here.
Okay, great. So thanks for bringing together such an interesting group of characters. I think the best way to introduce myself is I'm a lifelong student of staffing. I've really been interested and participated in different parts of the staffing space, as well as different jobs in staffing for longer than most people have been around. So I particularly am fascinated by the way in which we look at recruiting from the eyes of the different stakeholders. And the one stakeholder who has not really had the opportunity to participate in the space the way that I think they should is the candidate. And so for the last any number of years, I've been very much focused on what it is that the candidate is doing, what attitudes they have around the recruiting process, and to what extent that drives behavior that is either helpful or hinders the recruiting process, because we really need to measure it if we're going to empower recruiting leaders to go into their company and lobby for change. We've got to give them the data that allows them to do that. So that's kind of where I'm at.
Great, and we'll be talking about a little of that data in a few minutes. But last, and certainly not least, we have Andrew Gadomski, who is the CEO of Aspen Advisors. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you, Matt, and appreciate being part of the panel. I run Aspen Advisors, and we're a human capital consulting organization. We tend to work with large-scale corporations, outsourcing providers, third-party staffing agencies, and we analyze their processes on how they do recruiting, talent management, onboarding. And the way that we do that is we have gotten very good at analyzing data. We tend to take disparate systems of information and evidence, pull it together, and then drive it back to the actual processes and the business outcomes that those organizations have. Part of our charge is to make sure that you've got full transparency of evidence and proof in the recruiting process at all sides. And so we work with the Talent Board and the Candidate Experience Award on taking all this different data that they're bringing in, as well as data from other third parties, and managing it, two, being able to make it transparent, and then put it in a position where those organizations who are part of the candidate experience can make improvements downstream. And so it's my pleasure to be here as the resident data geek.
All right. Well, we need a resident data geek, so welcome. And speaking of that data, let's talk a little bit about what you learned today and what we hope you'll get out of this. As you can tell, obviously, with a combined close to a century of experience in this industry, these are some of the foremost thought leaders and business leaders in the space who are actually creating products and services designed to do something about what's often a nebulous buzzword, which is candidate experience. So what we actually hope that you'll get out of today is why candidate experience matters. We talk a lot about it, but what exactly is the business case and bottom line impact of it for recruiting in HR? We want to talk about how the rise in digital interviews and digital interviewing solutions really impact candidate experience, taking a look at how you can implement those technologies, as well as some of the myths and misconceptions that many of you have surrounding digital interviews and how they can best be implemented to optimize your hiring process. And finally, we'll give some tips and tricks if you do have a digital interviewing solution or considering purchasing one, how you can get that set up, ready to go for the best candidate experience and the best recruiting outcomes. So speaking of our data geek here, these are some stats that were recently generated from last year's Candidate Experience Awards. I'm hoping that Jerry and Andrew, you can talk a little bit about the data highlights that emerged from last year's study, as well as kind of the amount of data that was collected and the methodology for parsing it. So Jerry, if you could, just what were some highlights that really jumped out to you about the data that you're seeing from last year's awards?
Sure. I think it would help to just set the context in terms of what the awards are, too. So I'll take just a couple seconds to do that. But it started 4 years ago. Last year is where we have a full, complete set of data. We've really completed that for this year, but we have not yet jumped into that. So last year we had about 92 companies that participated fully in not only sharing how they treated candidates from their perspective, but also looked in the mirror and asked their candidates to share their perspective about their awareness about those practices and the extent to which they impacted their attitudes and behavior. And so what was amazing was that literally those 92 companies had 46,000 of their candidates complete surveys, and to a great extent, that's a pretty good size amount of data. After cleaning that up, we were in a position to give, with Andrew's help, to each and every company that participated back information that is their practices, their candidates' practices, and a benchmark against all the companies that participated. And that's where this data comes from. So, for example, you have several different items here. 69% of candidates use career sites to learn more about the company before applying. There were some other things too. 80% of the candidates, this is one of my favorite stats because it was one of those laugh out loud moments. 80% of the candidates that applied to the companies thought that the job descriptions were useful. And when I first saw that stat, I go, that's fascinating to me. It really was a laugh out loud because I don't think they're very useful. On the other hand, it's not about me. It is about the candidates. We need to understand what it is they want, what it is they're using, how they're using it, and the extent to which they're making good decisions as a result. So 59% of candidates reported 1 to 2 interviews related to the position for which they applied. 34% said the application process took between 31 to 60 minutes. Well, actually, no, that's not accurate. About a third said it was 31 to, it was 15 to 30. Yeah, it was 15 to 30, and another third, yeah, it's 31 to 60. Okay.
Yeah.
So from
2/3 to 60 minutes or less.
Yeah, to me, it's an extraordinary amounts of information. Now, the question is, did the amount of time it takes in an application actually impact attitude and or their behavior in terms of whether they would reapply or whether you could convert them? And so far, the data is suggesting that the amount of time taken in an application is not in and of itself correlated to whether or not somebody will then take a negative action or a positive action. But it's the kind of information that's asked in the application that impacts significantly how people are positive or negative. So down the road, as we have a conversation here, I think it's going to be important to talk not just about what the demographics are, but whether or not it impacts the behavior and attitudes of the candidates themselves. And that is that's kind of an ongoing process in which we're asking the data last year and now again this year that information. And I'll end with the fact that we closed on Friday the period in which we had now over 140, I think it was, Andrew, 140 companies, about a 50% increase from last year, participate. And we now have, as of Friday, 94,000 additional completed resumes to look at. So that's pretty interesting stuff.
Surveys.
Surveys, right.
that certainly defines big data, I guess. So thank you for walking us through that. And I want to move on, obviously, now to the conversation part of the component and pick your guys' brains. Again, if you're listening in and have any questions or comments you'd like us to relay to the speakers, feel free to use the chat window or the hashtag VC and E's. So I guess starting off, we're obviously talking a lot about candidate experience, and that seems to be one of those phrases that's quite subjective and amorphous, which it means different things to different people. I guess starting with you, David, in your mind, what is candidate experience, and what does that mean to building your strategy and product at RIVS?
Yeah, I mean, candidate experience speaks for itself, obviously, but the way that we look at it is, what does that candidate walk away with? What perception of the company that they're applying to? What is the perception of that company that they leave with? And is it a positive or negative one? And as we've discussed, depending on which it is, they will share that with their friends. They'll share that with their colleagues, and certainly, if they're a consumer of the product of the company that they're applying to, that's going to affect their buying decision, maybe not today, but down the road. So again, I think just the experience as they interact with the company, if there is interaction, and during the hiring process.
Great. And Ed, knowing that you obviously keep a close watch on some of these trends, there's a lot of talk about there things like a candidate bill of rights, all the way to creating automated responses and systems. In your opinion, knowing that there has to be an alignment between job seeker expectations and recruiting realities, what, at a minimum, do you think the candidate should have to expect from employers during the hiring process? In other words, what's the benchmark for, I guess, a solid candidate experience?
Sure. First of all, candidate experience, quite frankly, is the employer brand, pre-hire. So it's whatever candidate's experience and what their perception is of a company, that's what makes up your brand that's out there. So what I found surprising from the this is our fourth year running the awards, is that candidates don't really set the bar all that high. I mean, they are looking for, and as Jerry suggested, it's not necessarily the length of time, it's not necessarily the number of interviews, because sometimes that can be sometimes overwhelming, but it's really relevance. So the activities being relevant, not repetitive. So you don't want to have a candidate answering the same question 5 times on an application form or application process, or even in an interview scenario. And they want feedback. They want timely feedback. Those two things: relevant activity, so that they feel that what the time they're investing is meaningful, and then to be kept up to date, and have, even if being kept up to date means being told we're not interested right now. Those two things are really sort of, the bar that needs to be set.
Yeah,
Sure. And I guess to quantify. Oh, sorry, Jerry. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to add 2 things to that the conversation I've heard so far, and one is when we look at the issue around candidate experience, the first word is candidate, and there is a history, if you will, of us thinking about candidates only as the people that we hire. And especially if you start confronting employers around and recruiters around who is it that you actually learn from, they're learning from the finalists and the person who they hired. And it really is every person who you touch in that recruiting process from the beginning. So it's the people that you do not hire that is increasing in number and increasing in power to have an impact if we affect their attitudes and then their behaviors downstream. And so I just want to make a strong point that when we looked at the candidate experience, we're really looking at everyone who comes and researches your company, applies to your company, gets engaged in some kind of interview or screening process, all the way through onboarding, and that I think is a critical issue. The other is the relevance point that I absolutely agree with Ed's comment, and one of the relevance points, one of the practices that has constantly come up is the extent to which a candidate, when they apply or when they're interviewed or when they are reviewing the interview day, feels that they have had the opportunity to fully get up to bat and swing, to fully talk about the things that they think were relevant for them to compete for that job, in addition to the things that you, the employer, think are relevant. So when you can do both, when you can answer the question, did you have the ability to present the skills and talent that you have during an interview, when they answer that yes, they are tending positive both in attitude and in behavior. And when they do not feel that that's happened, they definitely turn negative. And so I think that becomes one of the benchmark floors in terms of a practice that I think corporations need to address.
Yeah, this is Matt, Andrew. Let me jump in on that. This actual topic that Jerry brought up about being able to present your skills and really take a swing at a pitch really is one of the key measures that we found correlates to a high or a good candidate experience from a company. The same companies that present, make someone feel that they're either very satisfied or they're satisfied with how they were able to present themselves, that group who scores well still may not provide very good feedback. Statistically, they haven't. They haven't given the candidate a concrete reason necessarily at 100% why or why not. The processes have been across the board in terms of interviews and so on, but this point of getting to bat really is a leading indicator of good candidate experience.
Sure. Great. And I'd like to address this question to Ed and Jerry in particular, knowing that you both founded the Candidate Experience Awards. You've been working on this issue for many years. Why do employers still suck at it? We've been talking about this forever now.
Go ahead, Ed.
Well, the bottom line is the bottom line. I mean, employers tend to focus on things where there's a very tangible financial impact, and the school of thought up until these last 5-6 years, where this movement has been evolving, is that candidates want to work for us, they'll jump through whatever hoops, whatever gauntlet we put in front of them, and if they don't have a good experience and we have a job for them in another 6 months, they'll come back. If they really want a job, they'll come back, and that's sort of been part of it. The other part is we've been just so internally focused on our own processes and getting that straight. There just hasn't been enough attention. But what this movement is about, and what the whole purpose of these awards is to put the spotlight on it and to create the body of knowledge and the stories to tell, as well as the data that we think will inevitably support a bottom line impact. This is the most ignored customer base on the planet, right? And we all know customer sat drives bottom line results, and we're going to see the same type of correlation here in terms of the way you treat candidates will definitely have an impact on your overall business. So I think as there's a recognition of that, we'll see much more investment from companies, and we're starting to see that now.
Sure. Andrew, just from a data point perspective, I know that I've seen some data correlating bottom line returns and candidate experience. Can you talk a little bit about some of those findings statistically? If I was building a business case for candidate experience in a business and trying to correlate that to actual bottom line results.
Yeah, what we need to be able to do is make some interesting links that show up statistically. So we need to be able to say that there's a group of practices that impact the attitude of a candidate and then the behavior of that candidate follows, that has an impact on the company's bottom line. That's where that ROI is going to come in. And that's kind of what we've been trying to do for the last 4 years, and what we're finding are some very interesting pieces of data. So for example, if some of the pieces that the practices that we've been talking about, in fact drive that attitude, the behaviors that we're seeing and trying to measure now are whether or not an individual would reapply. In terms of going out, getting additional skills, competencies, etc., coming back and reapplying. And what we're finding is that if we have treated that candidate well, about 60% of them would come back and reapply for the right position where they felt that they were capable of competing for it, even if they were told no the first time. And if they were not treated well, only 5% would. Now, I can do a little bit of a conversion as to the impact that that has on you as an employer, in terms of now the cost of going out and finding more applicants to replace the folks who might come back who were impressed with who you are and what you're doing, and realized that they didn't have yet the skills or the education, knowledge, and experience to be able to do the job. So that's one of the things. We have an additional behavior of whether or not an individual would refer other people to the company. And in the customer side, Net Promoter Score is based on a question related to a very similar question that we asked in the Candidate Experience Awards about whether or not you would refer someone else. And we have 4 answers that you could possibly have. One of them is, I go out of my way to refer someone else who is high quality to your company, something like that. Or I would go out of my way to discourage other people from applying in your company. And what we found is that if we treat those candidates well, if we can identify those clusters of practices that drive the positive side of that behavior, and you do as a company, you have something like 38% of the candidates who were treated well will go out of their way, not just neutral or yes I will, if they go out of their way. And if you treat them poorly, a quarter of all of those people will go, so 25% of all of those people, I think it was 27% last year, would go out of their way to discourage other people from applying. So you can, again, if I give you the data for your company, you can start putting some numbers, serious numbers, about the cost of recruiting not only the people who you hire, but handling the people you don't hire in such a way that it adds value to your recruiting process. And you could put a dollar number on that. That's going to make a difference.
Great. All awesome data. Again, lots of great information. I encourage anyone to ask any questions in the box or using the hashtag #VCNDs. I want to move on from kind of the applicant and process to one of the most important elements that was mentioned in the highlights, which is obviously the interview. I think the interview often tends to get overlooked, beyond the black hole that we generally associate with, as being a really critical driver of a candidate experience. And there are some solutions, obviously, that are emerging to help deliver better interviewing experiences to get that ROI and impact the bottom line results that we just talked about. So with that, I wanted to turn it over to David. David, I guess, very high level, in your experience, what is the impact that you see of interviews on the overall candidate experience, and what, I guess, impact or correlation have you found that making those interviews digital has one way or the other on that overall experience?
Yeah, so I'll tackle the first piece. I mean, I do think, and these guys I'm sure can speak more eloquently to this, but it's clear the interview process has a huge impact on candidate experience. I mean, I'll just start with a quick story of my own job coming out of college. you know, I was over in South Bend, Indiana, applying to jobs in Chicago, and I finally found the company that I thought I'd really like to work for. Had 7 interviews with the same sort of level of folks, and those were all considered second-round interviews. And I literally, or excuse me, so yeah, 5 of them were considered second-round interviews. Literally the same questions from the same people who were mostly doing their jobs at the same time that they were interviewing me. And I thought to myself, wow, you know, it would be great if, you know, they could just all sit down and interview me at once, or, you know, actually review the notes of the person, or at least just pay attention to me as we're interviewing. But it was not that way, and you know, I really kind of left that with a bad taste in my mouth. I ended up taking the job, but I didn't stay very long there. And I think, you know, that same sort of, I think lack of respect is probably the term that I would use, you know, was found throughout the company. So I think that is actually what you guys mentioned earlier as a an indicating factor for how the company actually operates. You know, candidates get that too, right? When it comes to digital interviews, I think there are 2 things really to think about, right? When we talk about the pre-recorded or the one-way interviews, we often get the question, isn't this impersonal? You know, why don't people want to speak with me over the phone? Well, you know, the answer is they do, but they just don't always have the time, right? Especially when you're dealing with hundreds and potentially thousands of candidates for one role. And with the one-way interviews, this is really a chance for candidates to tell their story in a way that it's just not possible to do with a resume or cover letter or even a personality assessment. I think when it comes to the live interviews, the live video interviews, going back to my earlier story, it would have been great to have had one live video interview, maybe recorded with their best interviewer and shared across the company versus going in and, you know, driving into Chicago 7 times, essentially the same interview, leaving a pretty bad taste in my mouth at the end of the day. So, you know, I think digital interviews really have a huge role to play here, and I think when used properly and effectively can really impact the candidate experience.
Great. So I want to turn the question over to Andrew. Andrew, I know through our conversations, obviously, you're in a good position, which is you are leading a growth business. You're adding headcount. You've obviously have a lot of experience, you know, as a hiring manager and also within the recruitment space. What advice do you have for building an optimal interview process? In other words, if you were to start from scratch to develop a perfect interviewing process that's going to yield the best candidate experience, talk a little bit about what that looks like.
Well, I think the first thing is you know, it's probably escalating it to a point of let's talk about it as an assessment process, and interviews are part of it. So with all the different technologies and the way that we're hiring globally, you need to think about what are the tools that you're going to use to help you with assessment that's going to create a strong candidate experience based on who that candidate or group of candidates is. And I think we've come a long way from the days of let's just have one process and put it everywhere, right? We don't need to do that. Technologies that we use every day enable us to have variety and get to assessment that's appropriate. And so if I was to start from scratch, I probably would look at what are the 3 or 4 critical hires in the business that I need to spend more time in assessment and more care because they have a higher return on investment and a higher level of business outcome or impact to the business. For a technology company, that could be engineering or it could be leadership or what have you. If you're a manufacturing company, it could be in safety or it could be in development. If you're a retail organization, it could be customer service. And so you need to look at where the critical roles are, what's the appropriate assessment, and then use technology, you know, and methods that are appropriate for those particular cases. I think that being said,
well, then you can use, you know, what you're then doing is being able to pull together the data, good quality data about the individual that you're going to have a conversation with. And now the opportunity, I think, is to have a quality conversation with individuals And using digital media is an extraordinary way if we can set a standard for how we operate on that platform. So one of the things I would want is the ability to have or offer training to any one of the candidates who's now going to be in a conversation with me and or my recruiters about the assessment data that you've just talked about. That's powerful.
Yeah, and there's, Jerry's right, and I think the other thing is you set up these different assessment methodologies that use technology, that use questioning, and digital interviewing goes well beyond this concept of video. It's using the concepts of text, of multiple choice questioning, assessments that can be customized, that can be stored. All those things need to be leveraged. But you also have to communicate to the candidate up front what these processes are and why they're helpful for not only the company, but for them. What advantages does it give them? You know, the retail organizations are really struggling with this. The fast food chains of the world. The only way a lot of these people have access to the internet who show up at these jobs is a mobile device. That's their way to get to communicate. And next thing you know, it's like, well, we want to do this kind of assessment, this kind of interviewing, blah, blah, blah. Well, there may not be a mobile solution that's available, or maybe there is only certain mobile solutions that are available that help you get the data and get the assessment that you need. So the long-winded response, or the short response, Matt, is take a lot of care in the 3 or 4 different types of jobs you have to get a hold of and have different types of assessment methodologies that make sense.
Okay, great. And so I guess kind of a final question here, and I'll turn this to Ed. Ed, I guess in your mind, what exactly can organizations do to make sure that their interview process is optimized for candidate experience? In other words, are there any benchmarks or things they can be looking at on an individual company level to help make sure that their processes are aligned and candidate experience is optimal?
Well, you could definitely go out and benchmark like crazy on this, and you can ask 100 TA leaders, hey, what's your interview process, and maybe get 110 different answers. The reality is you've got to come up with a best practice for an optimal practice for your own organization, for the types of roles. And so the most important aspect, and I mentioned this earlier from a candidate's perspective, is they want to make sure that what they're doing is relevant and that there's clear communication. So Andrew, you said it very, very well, that if you're pushing digital interviews, let's say the one-way recorded, make sure you got to be communicating why you're doing it, and typically a one-way recorded interview is logistically it might be very challenging for schedules to align, and it's a way for the organization to move quickly and for the candidate to get their information in front of decision makers quickly. So you got to communicate that, give them I like the idea of letting them practice and get better at it. I think over time, as millennials start becoming a bigger percentage of the candidate base, there'll be less concern about talking into webcams, but that's a new skill for a lot of people, and making sure that people have the adequate support and opportunity to feel confident that when they do one of these, that it's going to be their best foot forward. And with respect to the person being personal, I think you could actually argue that a live digital interview is a lot more personal than a phone screen. So it's how you package it, how you communicate it, making sure that the right hand knows what the left hand is doing, because the worst experience for a candidate is when they go through a series of interviews and they're asked the exact same questions over and over again as if they've never provided the response. So I actually do think digital interviewing helps companies minimize that kind of overlap. But again, it's all about being very clear and communicating so that a candidate it knows that the investment of time that they're making is a good investment of time, and it's not just being squandered.
Sure, and I we keep talking about being good with feedback and communication. So I just want to ask, in terms of closing that loop, obviously you slate 5 candidates for an average requisition. Only one of them gets a job out of the 5 who've interviewed. What advice do you have for giving feedback, and what specifically should employers or recruiters focus on when giving that feedback to a candidate that's not selected, given the fact that I think a recurring thing that I hear is that a perception that no news is better than bad news? And I'll turn that question to Jerry, actually.
I love that question. I think it's kind of fascinating to me. One of the problems is whether or not they want the feedback. So the first issue is to be honest and ask them, do they want feedback? If you're prepared to try and give them some, no matter how small or large it's going to be, they should be fully cognizant that they're looking in the mirror. I know that one company a year or so ago, Chris Hoyt at PepsiCo, had offered or gave feedback to a group of about 100 candidates unsolicited, and found himself responding to a lot of concerns on their part because no one had ever done that before. So the first issue is candidates get so little feedback that the shock of getting it is a big one, and they should be prepared for that. Second thing, there has to be training. You cannot give people feedback that is reasonable, that you can point to and measure, unless you've been trained to do that. Otherwise, you're making up stuff about attitudes and things that are not that easily measured, and not giving good examples of that. So you're just not doing it well. I would focus, and again, it's a training issue. You need to focus in on very specific behaviors, skills, or knowledge that can and were observed that have to do with your success in doing the job. So it has to be bona fide. You cannot be giving them feedback on stuff that is outside of the parameters of the job. So fundamentally, you have to focus in on that, and if you have not done it and done it well, and most recruiters have not been trained to do that, they're not going to be doing it well. So the first issue is whether you want to do it, at what level do you want to do it, and then train individuals to do it and to do it well. Intuit is a good example of a company that is in fact training recruiters to give feedback to internal candidates only, and I think that's where I would start. Once companies are focused in on making a commitment, at least for the development of their own people, to give them feedback, and if you have to hire coaches to help you engage in that process, then you can decide on whether or not there is a value in giving feedback to external candidates, so perhaps they would know what to go out and get before they come back and reapply and compete successfully. So those are some of the thoughts that I would have. I don't think this is an easy shift. It's not going to happen in a lot of companies. The concern from a risk point of view and a legality point of view is very high for a lot of corporations, but the reward of being able to do this well would differentiate you in a competitive environment overnight.
Jerry, I agree 100%, but I also think even with those organizations where the risk is perceived too high to make a move, they could still improve upon the standard communication of thanks but no thanks, right? I think one of the big, right?
That's a great point.
One of the big pitfalls, especially with all this great technology that we have. I mean, it was better back in 1990 when we sent postcards. What companies are doing with the technology is they set the rec up to do auto closeout correspondence, and so you might have made a decision on a candidate, but they don't get that correspondence until the rec is filled, which could be after many, many interviews, after a decision to make an offer, and then when that person comes on board. So some of the stories and anecdotes that I've heard is that candidates might, 6 months later get a reject, and sometimes they get that reject letter after they've been hired for a different job within the same company.
Here's an easy one that could change, and it's really a matter of making a decision to do it. The fact that you get back to a candidate at all saying that you have the job or you don't have the job, it's closed out, is feedback, even if you're not going to go any further than that. And at the very base, there is absolutely no excuse for doing that. However, most corporations have they're silver medalists. They've gone through them. They now have made an offer to Joe Matarazzi, and they have to decide whether to tell the other 4 that they have made an offer and expect it to come back. And I will tell you that most companies will not tell the other 4 silver medalists until at least that individual has accepted. And even when they've accepted, they tend not to want to tell them until the person actually comes and is on board.
Right.
And I don't think there's a legitimacy around that. I think fundamentally that's really where this black hole gives us a bad name. We really need to step up and be more transparent that fundamentally you are among the finalists. Here is here's what you've had. Here's what we appreciate about where you are. And yes, we have an outstanding offer to someone else, but we felt that it was important to let you know at this time. I am convinced you would win huge goodwill from those candidates who then would want to potentially reapply, because many of them might be folks you would definitely want to hire down the road, rather than those who are going to suddenly turn negative on you.
I think, Matt, to jump in on this one, is we got caught up many years ago as we started using technology with this concept of the funnel, where we have these visuals where we have all these candidates coming into the top of the funnel, and then what comes out is like this perfect candidate at the bottom. And the thing is that recruiting produces a lot of effort that's not highly leveraged long term. And so we know that we have 50 people who are going to apply. And we know that we're going to tell 49 of them, no thank you. We're going to have 10 people we're going to probably phone screen. And we're going to tell probably 4 or 5 of them, I'm sorry, we're not going to bring you in for an interview. And then of the 4 people we interview, we're going to tell 3 of them no. So if we fundamentally look at our goals and objectives of how we communicate to our stakeholders as business leaders, we say these kinds of things more than we say yes. So how are we going to take care to do that? Because one of the chief stakeholders is not just the candidate, it's the candidate that we're turning away. In fact, we do that more than anything else. And I think if we start looking at our behaviors, our data, and our processes with that kind of a lens, any organization that just takes initiative that way and does that exercise is going to be in a much better position than a lot of companies out there who aren't thinking that way.
And I think that those are great points. This, in the interest of time, this has been a fascinating conversation. I definitely want to bring it back to the digital interviewing point, and I'm gonna ask this question of David. David, when we talk about setting candidate expectations, training and socializing new technologies and platforms, obviously digital interviewing is still relatively new. It's continuing to move from the margins to the mainstream. What are the best ways to get candidates or even hiring managers comfortable with adopting this new technology in order to get the most out of it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, from the candidate perspective, we go to great lengths to help candidates practice, get themselves ready to perform that interview, many, many times. And I would say our counterparts do a very good job of that as well, because we do understand this is new, and it's very new for most people. And as it was mentioned earlier, interviewing in front of a webcam, whether it's two-way or one-way, is a new skill. And I don't think anybody really expects any of the candidates to be excellent at it the very first time. So we go to great lengths to try to educate and train those folks. But I think as well, employers have a responsibility, and this is something that we coach and train during onboarding and sort of ongoing check-in calls with our clients. Just say, hey, listen, what's working, what's not, and we listen to some of the things they've done. We coach them on preparing the candidate prior to the interview. I think it was mentioned earlier, but it's worth reiterating. You really just have to say, this is what the interview process looks like. After you apply, you'll be invited to a one-way video interview, or we're going to reach out to you and talk to you in person, but then potentially invite you to a video interview so that we can share with the rest of our company, or so we have on file your responses. And I'd say, from the hiring manager perspective, that's a really interesting question, because it is a challenge, I think. Even from an employer's standpoint, they've got this great new tool. Actually getting people to use it and really see the benefits of it can be challenging sometimes. We have, at RIBS, we have, again, a pretty robust onboarding and ongoing training platform and process. But beyond that, we even have folks use it internally, as was mentioned earlier. We have some companies sending internal surveys to one another, or they'll use it for internal assessments. As an example, when one of our clients uses it for testing their onboarding effectiveness. Okay, so at the end of their onboarding process, they'll actually have their folks do a set of video interview questions, and they'll sort of rehash what it was they learned, how was the onboarding process, get some feedback, and so on and so forth. But I think just sort of getting hiring managers and users' hands on it, getting them to use it a little bit, it really goes a long way in terms of adoption.
So just, I guess, finishing up very briefly, we've talked about a lot of these points about quantifying and measuring candidate experiences, but I do want to turn this over to Andrew to just talk about what, I guess, what data points are you seeing companies collect in aggregate to determine the efficacy of their recruiting programs, and how do you see candidate experience fitting in both in the short and long term?
I think one of the things that we're starting to get excited about is how companies, especially those who already have a way, they have a more formal relationship with their customer base, whether they're retail or they're banking or they're an online retail, an online organization. They're starting to understand, are the people who are applying to their jobs customers? Or are the people who are applying to these jobs have a relationship with us just in social media as consumers? And I think that correlation is starting to drive a conversation around how are we treating people in terms of employment that do business with us. And I think that's very exciting. That's a big data play. That's not easy stuff to do, especially if you have tens of thousands of customers like a bank. But it's a move in the right direction. I think the other thing that's interesting to see is we're seeing a lot of relationships between the financial data and costs associated with recruiting become much more sophisticated. And as things become more sophisticated, we're starting to ask questions of, well, how many people are we really talking to? Why are we talking to them? What's the ROI of the cost, not just per hire, but per interview, per screen, per applicant, per reach out? And that's starting to change the way we're thinking about driving the candidate experience and how we use technologies and processes differently to drive value at the incremental level that overall this really adds up. Those two things around more sophisticated financials and more sophisticated relationships with your customers seems to be on the rise and very effective.
Great.
Matt,
so
I have some questions here from the audience. Do you think we can just pop one or two of those?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Anna.
Oh, you bet. So Denny says here, what about the legal implication of giving feedback? Many legal teams throw upon this. This, I guess, is the feedback, not just a yes or no, but why you didn't get the job, for instance?
Well, it's just it's a total issue around risk, and in a litigious society, the more information you have from a lawyer's point of view, the more likely you can be sued, and companies fear suits more than they are concerned about it when they are sued. But the point is, we have to get over this risk issue and focus in on some of the reward issues. And in my opinion, especially in a competitive environment, the rewards outweigh the risks. But you have to mitigate that risk by having solid training, and it's not it's not the way we've done things in the past. So we have a tremendous inertia in this area, but we are going to see more and more companies show that they make a winning play by providing at least some minimum level of feedback.
And companies that, I think to this point, companies that have a little bit more sophisticated assessment process that's focused on the job or job family are much more armed to answer these questions with more robust details. They can talk about assessments that they use, and they can be much more objective. I think sometimes this issue comes up because we fear that what we're saying is subjective and then open for discussion, versus this is our process and we have certain gates that we pass along. Here's the feedback of how you performed. That's fine.
Right. Combining multiple assessments with interviews as an assessment, I think increasingly will have extraordinary value. Other countries like Australia are way ahead of us when it comes to this. So we have been behind in part because of our fear of almost doing any kind of data gathering. And I think we're starting to get over it. And I think that we're also going to favor digital interviews because you can set a more consistent standard platform as well as potentially archiving that data of the interview. And I think that's going to be powerful for those companies willing to do that. So I'm a fan of digital interviews for a variety of reasons. And I was in a room not long ago when with 40 companies, 4 of whom, so 10%, said we have not yet done a digital interview because of our fear of litigation, and 4 companies on the other end of that normal distribution said we have done enough digital interviews that we are now so comfortable that we want to create a common platform for how we engage our candidates, and all interviews will be digital.
Sure. And with that in mind, we're running up against the end of the hour. I know there are a lot of other questions. So before the recording shuts off, I'd like to thank our guests for their time. Great insights and conversation, particularly Rivs for helping us with this event. And just want to let everyone know, if you do have questions, please email those and we'll answer them. You can email matt@recruitingblogs.com and I'll get them to the correct speaker. And a recording of this webinar along with a deck and some of the top-level takeaways will be sent to all attendees and posted online within 48 hours. So with that, thank you all for attending today's Recruiting Blogs webinar, and appreciate a great conversation and lessons.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
And that is the conclusion of our webinar for today. Thank you.